I always imagined that if my wedding ever fell apart, it would be because of some storm, some freak accident, or some dramatic revelation about the groom's past. Never did I think it would come down to a single sentence spoken in a polished tone during dessert in front of 204 people. The venue was stunning, an architectural marvel perched above the cliffs in Santa Barbara. White chairs lined up like a magazine spread orchids flown in from somewhere expensive strings playing Vivaldi, and napkins monogrammed with J and C in gold. Every detail was perfect, down to the ice cubes shaped like hearts. My fiancé James stood near the bar laughing with his colleagues from his father's tech firm. I sat next to my mother Diane. She looked elegant in her simple navy dress, one she had altered herself from something she bought at a thrift store. Her silver hair was pinned up carefully, her lipstick just a shade darker than usual. She looked beautiful to me. Always had. She leaned in and whispered, "Just get through the night, honey. Then we can breathe." She always said things like that. Not in a dramatic way, just like a woman who had lived through years of swallowing her pride, of staying composed when others tried to chip away at her dignity. I nodded. "We're almost there, Mom." Then came the toast. Edward. My father took the mic. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo tailored in Milan, and a smile that always felt 2 seconds too late. I hadn't seen him much growing up. He and Mom split when I was 6. He remarried quickly, started another family. Still sent the checks. Still made sure we knew who had the money and who didn't. He lifted his glass. Tonight, he said, we're not just celebrating love. We're celebrating success. The kind of success that doesn't come from privilege, but from pulling yourself up. Some women do that by marrying well. Others, well, they just get lucky. There was laughter, tight, uncertain. My fingers curled under the table. He went on. But let's also take a moment to acknowledge Diane here. She's done a fine job raising Clara. On a nurse's salary, no less. That takes grit. Mom didn't move. Her fork was still. Her jaw didn't clench. That was her way. Controlled, steady. But I saw the flicker in her eyes. The same one I used to see when a landlord raised the rent again, or a patient's family shouted at her during a long night shift. Then came Felicity, my older sister. Always the golden one. Ivy League, married into a powerful legal family, ran in circles with people who called housekeepers the help. She raised her glass. And let's not forget, Felicity said sweetly, how far Clara's come. From school scholarships and shared apartments to standing here today, with us, in this room. More laughter. Not cruel, worse condescending. "And Diane," she added, turning toward my mother, "I'm sure you never dreamed your daughter would marry into the type of family that owns properties like this." Must be surreal, that was it. That was the sentence. Quiet, silky, and poisonous. The table went silent. James laughed softly. "Oh, come on. It's a joke," he said to no one in particular. But it wasn't a joke. Not to me. I stood up. James looked confused. "Babe," I didn't speak. I took my mother's hand. "Clara," she whispered. I turned to the room. Every face was watching now. Waiting, some curious, some concerned, some just annoyed that dessert had been interrupted. "Thank you for the reminder," I said slowly, "of everything I never want to become." Then I walked out, with my mother beside me. No tears, no screaming, no second-guessing. Just silence, and the sound of my heels against the marble floor. Behind me, someone gasped. Another voice said, "Is she serious?" Yes, I was. I wasn't ruining a wedding. I was saving myself. I suppose I always knew I was the extra in my own family. Growing up, our apartment had thin walls and a broken radiator. Winters were cold enough that you could see your breath inside. Summers made the paint peel from the kitchen windows. But it was home. Just me and Mom in a space we made warm with Book's tea and the smell of hair dye from her second job. She was a nurse by day and a hairstylist by night, unlicensed but gifted. Every woman in our building trusted her with their hair. She cut, colored, and styled with the grace of a woman who'd learned to create beauty from chaos. Sometimes she'd balance a bowl of pasta in one hand and a comb in the other. That was her magic, holding everything together without ever making it look heavy. My father, Edward, left when I was 6. He told Mom he couldn't live like this anymore. By this, he meant the cramped space, the coupons, the broken elevator. He moved across town into a sleek condo with glass walls and marble countertops. I remember the first time I visited him after he left. Everything looked expensive and smelled like lemon polish, but nothing felt like home. He remarried quickly. Her name was Evelyn. She came with a teenage daughter, perfect hair, and matching pearl earrings. They became a new family with brunches and ski trips and a fridge stocked with name-brand yogurt. I became a guest welcomed but not included. Then came Felicity, my half-sister. She arrived like a royal announcement, born into comfort, raised on ballet lessons and SAT tutors. Everyone adored her. She was everything I wasn't: polished, poised, predictable. She never missed a thank you note or a fundraiser. She was the daughter who got her own monogrammed towels before she turned 10. Dad sent checks, yes. He paid for school supplies, doctor visits, even my first laptop. But everything came with a kind of unspoken tag: remember who's saving you. I got good at pretending not to notice. When I was accepted into UC Berkeley's architecture program, I called him. I was so proud. His first response: "That's great. Maybe you can help redesign the apartment building you grew up in." I laughed politely. That night, I cried into my pillow. Mom celebrated with me like I had won the Pulitzer. She took me out for dollar tacos, even though I knew she'd skipped her own lunch to afford it. She bought me a used drafting kit and packed it like a Christmas gift. "You're going to build beautiful things," she said, "and I'll be the first to walk through anything you design." During college, I worked 2 jobs and lived off ramen and discount fruit. But I loved every class, every late-night sketch session. Buildings to me weren't just steel and glass, they were stories. Stories of who gets to belong and who gets shut out. Every now and then I'd be invited to Edward's home. Evelyn would pour wine. Felicity would talk about her clerkship with a federal judge. I'd listen, nod, and try to keep my hands from trembling as I held my glass. They never asked about Mom. Never said her name. It was like she didn't exist. She did her best, I once told Edward. She had limitations, he replied. That phrase lived in my chest for years. After college, I landed a junior architect role at a mid-size firm. It didn't pay much, but I learned everything: design systems, public zoning, green space advocacy. Eventually, I started my own small firm with 2 friends. We called it Ground Up because we believed the best communities start from the people, not the penthouses. It was hard, sometimes impossible, but we built slowly and surely. We took on abandoned lots, small parks, community centers. One of our proposals turned a neglected bus stop into a food co-op with solar lighting and free Wi-Fi. Another restored a low-income senior housing block with dignity and color. Through it all, Mom was my anchor. She never quite understood the technical parts, but she got the spirit of it. "You're giving people space to be proud in," she once said. "That's more than most architects ever do." Meanwhile, Felicity was climbing fast corporate law luxury weddings, a townhouse in DC. My father sent me her holiday cards each year: gold foil embossed perfect families smiling on staircases. One year, he underlined her job title: Senior Counsel, Federal Regulatory Division. Mom didn't say anything, just folded the card and slid it into the trash. When I met James, I thought something was finally changing. A chance to start a family on new terms. With someone who saw me, not just where I came from. But I didn't know yet how easily some men shift in the presence of power. I didn't realize that James admired my independence until it began to threaten his place in a family like mine. I should have seen the signs sooner. But when you grow up trying to prove you belong, you learn to overlook a lot. I met James on a construction site. It was the kind of community rehab project I lived for: an old textile warehouse being converted into a mixed-use space with low-income housing, a green rooftop, and a child wellness clinic. The city had dragged its feet on permits, the funding was tight, and the roof leaked every time it rained. But still, it felt meaningful. James showed up one morning in a clean shirt and leather boots that had never seen dirt. He was representing one of the venture groups backing the project, and he had questions about our budget versus the estimated value impact. While the rest of the investors looked bored or annoyed, James stayed after the walkthrough and asked about our design priorities. I talked about sunlight access, pedestrian flow, how we were planting trees in the north-facing courtyard to help mitigate summer heat without extra cooling systems. He didn't interrupt, he just listened. By the end of the meeting, we were sharing a lukewarm coffee on a plastic crate near the stairwell. He told me his background Stanford MBA, son of a tech family with a complicated dynamic, which I later realized was code for money and emotional distance. I told him about Ground Up and my obsession with community-centric design. I even mentioned Mom. She sounds amazing, he said. That's when I let my guard down. James started showing up more. He invited me to dinners then to his place, a sleek loft with floor-to-ceiling windows, all sharp lines and designer furniture. But there were soft spots too. A worn leather jacket by the door, an old acoustic guitar he couldn't play well, a framed photo of his grandmother in a sun hat. We talked about architecture, about cities, about how space creates identity. He said things like, "You treat buildings like people." And I thought he gets it. We were opposites in many ways. He was buttoned up. I was scrappy. He liked control. I liked chaos that led to growth, but I liked the balance. I liked the way he respected my work. Or so I thought. The first red flag came the day he met Felicity. We were at a fundraiser for affordable housing reform. She glided in like a senator's wife, all practiced smiles and eye contact, just sharp enough to cut. She gave James one look and decided she approved. "You're charming," she told him. "Let's hope you're smart, too." He laughed like it was a compliment. That night he said, "Your sister's intense, but impressive." I said she's everything my father ever wanted in a daughter. He didn't ask what that meant. Later he met Edward. I was nervous, but it went smoothly, too smoothly. They shook hands like they were old colleagues. My father poured him scotch, and by the end of the night, they were discussing tax codes and real estate portfolios. James smiled all the way home. "I think your dad really likes me," he said. "I didn't say it out loud, but I thought he liked you because you're not me." Still, I kept trying to believe that we were building something of our own, that I wasn't marrying back into the same hierarchy I spent my life escaping. Then came the proposal. Simple suite in the park. No drones, no flash mobs, just him a ring and a shaky voice saying, "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. I want to build a life with you." I said yes, because I wanted it to be true, because I wanted to believe he saw all of me and chose me anyway. But I would learn not long after that what James admired most about me was how easy I made it for him to look like he loved someone independent without ever being challenged by that independence. About 3 months before the wedding, I got a message from my father's assistant asking me to review a zoning report for one of his new projects. This wasn't unusual. He'd occasionally loop me into architectural reviews for appearances, especially when press or public input was involved. I had learned to treat it like theater. I'd offer feedback, he'd nod, then ignore 90% of it. But this report was different. It was for a new mixed-use complex being developed on public-private land backed by Edwards Company and a trust fund whose name I didn't recognize. When I looked closer, that trust was listed as a legacy entity managed by direct heirs. Only, I wasn't listed. Felicity was. So was James. But not me. I stared at the document for a long time, thinking it must have been an oversight. I called my father's office. The assistant hesitated, then transferred me directly to Edward. "Ah, Clara," he said, cheerful as ever. "Thanks for looking it over." "I just have one question," I said, keeping my voice even. "Why is my name not on the Legacy Trust?" There was a pause. He cleared his throat. "It's more of a legal structure thing," he said. "We had to streamline the paperwork. Too many cooks in the kitchen, you know." "I'm your daughter," I said. "Of course," he replied quickly. "But Felicity's been involved in these deals for years. And James has the financial acumen to help manage things long term. You have your firm, your projects. We didn't want to pull you away from that." That was when I knew. They hadn't just forgotten me. They deliberately excluded me. Later that night, Mom and I were folding wedding favors at her kitchen table. Little envelopes of wildflower seeds, a nod to the sustainability theme I'd insisted on. I told her what happened. She didn't say anything right away, just kept folding. Then she said, "Did they sign off on this trust recently?" "About 6 weeks ago," I said. She stood up, went to the cabinet above the fridge, and pulled down an old folder. Inside were copies of emails, scanned deeds, and a printed chain of correspondence between Edward's firm and a private notary. "You're not the only one they've underestimated," she said, sliding the papers toward me. I stared at her. You've been tracking this. I may not have a degree, she said, but I can still read contracts. And I know when something smells off. It hit me then just how much she had been watching quietly from the sidelines. Not interfering, just waiting. I wanted to let you figure it out, she added, but I couldn't stand the idea of them pulling this kind of thing and you not knowing. I flipped through the papers. It was all there. The dates, the signatures. Felicity had signed on behalf of my father. James had co-signed as an advisory beneficiary, whatever that meant. All behind my back. They weren't just marrying me into the family. They were marrying me out of my own inheritance. The next day I confronted James. We were at a wine tasting event hosted by one of his father's business partners. Everyone looked perfect silk scarves, linen suits, gentle jazz in the background. I pulled him aside, away from the crowd. "Why didn't you tell me about the trust?" I asked. He blinked. "What trust? The one you're listed on? The one that was signed 6 weeks ago?" His face tightened. "It's not like that," he said quickly. "Your dad said you weren't interested in the business side, that you were too focused on ground up. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't," I cut in. "You just signed. You didn't ask me. You didn't even tell me." He put a hand on my arm. "It's just money, Clara." "No," I said, pulling away. "It's power. It's legacy. And it was mine as much as it was Felicity's, as much as it was yours. But you let them erase me, and you smiled through it." I walked away before he could answer. That night, I sat on my mother's porch staring out at the tiny patch of grass she'd kept alive for years with buckets of dishwater and love. I thought about how often she'd been erased, overlooked, dismissed, and how she never let it harden her. I also thought about how easily James had become one of them. When I was younger, I used to dream about being welcomed into the family, sitting at the table as an equal, earning my place. But now I understood. There was no seat for me, because I wasn't meant to be part of it. I was meant to be used by it, and I had no intention of letting that happen. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 p.m., just as the sun dipped low enough to cast golden light across the terrace. The venue was the kind of place people booked a year in advance: polished limestone floors, sculpted hedges, and imported chandeliers that looked like upside-down constellations. Everything had been curated, from the string quartet to the folded napkins shaped like lotus flowers. Felicity oversaw most of the details. She called it elegance with restraint. I called it suffocating. As guests began to settle in, I stood with my mother near the dressing room, looking out through the window at rows of carefully arranged chairs. She wore the same navy dress she'd altered by hand. She looked beautiful, composed, like she always did when the world tried to shame her. I'd almost called it off that morning, but she looked at me over breakfast and said, "We don't run, we show up, and we look them in the eye." So I did. The first signs came during the reception. It was subtle at first. Whispers at nearby tables, side glances. Someone said, "That must be the mother." I thought she was catering staff. I pretended not to hear it. So did Mom. Dinner came and went. Then came the toasts. Edward stood first, his voice smooth and controlled. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate more than a marriage. We celebrate a joining of legacies, a future built on values, on tradition, on ambition, and on strength of character." I looked down at my plate. He continued, "Not everyone starts from the same place. Some of us come from privilege. Others, well, from more modest roots. But that's the beauty of this country. Even those without much can still find a seat at the table." Laughter, polite, but pointed. He raised his glass toward my mother, to Diane, who taught Clara resilience, and to Clara for rising above it. Applause, glasses clinking. My mother didn't move. Then Felicity stood holding a flute of champagne. "And let's give thanks," she said sweetly, "to the people who raised us, who shaped our worldview, who taught us the importance of aspiration." She turned to face the crowd. "Clara has always been a dreamer, but dreaming doesn't get you into rooms like this. Tenacity does, and guidance, and of course connections." More smiles, more tight laughter. She lifted her glass toward Mom. "It must be surreal, Diane, watching your daughter marry into a world so far from where you started." That was when the real silence began. the kind of silence that prickles your skin. James was standing near the stage. He didn't say anything. He smiled, just like the rest of them. That was when I stood. Everyone turned to look. James stepped forward. "Clara, wait. It's a joke. They're just joking." I looked at him. "This is your version of family humor." "They don't mean anything by it," he said quietly. "It's our day. Don't ruin it." "No," I said. "I'm not ruining it." I turned to my mother, held out my hand. "We're done here." I didn't shout. I didn't cry. We walked out together. Through the marble doors, past the stunned faces, the clinking glasses, the whispers behind us. "She's leaving? Is this real? She just ruined everything." But they were wrong. I wasn't ruining anything, and I was leaving everything that had already tried to ruin me. We didn't speak much on the ride back. The silence was dense, but not awkward. It was the kind of silence that fills the space when something heavy has finally been set down. Mom and I drove through neighborhoods that felt like memory lanes, old laundromats, corner stores, the tiny park where I used to sketch on Saturday mornings. We passed the faded mural on Maple Street that she used to call a masterpiece waiting to be seen. Eventually, we pulled up to her apartment. The building hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same rusted railing, same flickering hallway light, but it was still warm inside, still smelled faintly of hairspray and mint tea. She made tea as she always did. 2 mugs, one with a chip on the handle, the one I'd always used. I didn't even take off my shoes. I just sat there in my wedding dress, heels tight, head throbbing. She placed my mug in front of me, then sat across the table and said nothing. I stared at her for a long time. "They hate you," I finally said. "Finally. They hate me too. They just smile while doing it." She sipped her tea. "They don't hate us. They don't know us. And people fear what they don't understand. But James did know me," I said, my throat tightening. "He saw what they were doing. And he let it happen." She nodded. "Because fitting in is easier than standing up." Her words landed hard. "I let it happen too," I whispered. "I saw it coming. I kept brushing it off. I thought if I just stayed calm, stayed smart, maybe they'd accept me." "Clara," she said gently, "they didn't need someone to accept. They needed someone to display." I looked at her, really looked at her, the lines near her eyes, the strength in her shoulders, the patience in her voice. She'd been through worse. She had survived worse. But I didn't want to survive this. I wanted to rebuild from it. "I can't go back," I said. "I know, they'll never respect me." She gave a small smile, then stopped waiting for them too. I sat with those words, chewing them like truth too big to swallow. That night, I pulled out the old file folder she had given me, the one with all the trust paperwork. I laid it out on the table piece by piece. Signatures, dates, business names. I started cross-referencing names with our firm's public project registries. That's when something strange emerged. One of the entities listed in the trust, Midpoint Properties, had been a shadow investor in 3 public development projects I'd designed through ground up. My name, my designs, my labor, their profit, without my knowledge. I spent the next 2 hours mapping connections, pulling emails, calling my firm's legal contact. He picked up half asleep and said, "Wait, are you telling me your father used GroundUp's name to access city funds? I'm telling you, I think I've been a silent face for his portfolio. And I want that silence to end." The next morning, I called a friend from law school who owed me a favor. She specialized in nonprofit protection and intellectual property. I explained everything: how I'd been cut out of the trust, how James and Felicity had signed over my share, how Edward had used my image and work to curry favor with development boards. She paused and said, "You realize this isn't just a family problem, right? This is legal, possibly criminal." I nodded. "Do you want to sue? No?" I said. "I want to own." Over the next 3 weeks, while rumors about my wedding walkout trickled into social media gossip columns, I stayed quiet and very, very busy. Using GroundUp's connections and my mother's saved documents, I began acquiring silent stakes in my father's holding companies through layered anonymous partnerships. Some of it I bought, some I called in favors for. All of it I did legally. Clean, documented, untouchable. By the end of the third week, I owned a controlling interest in Midpoint Properties and two other subsidiaries under Edward's firm. And no one saw it coming. On the outside, I was the runaway bride, the one who snapped under pressure. Inside, I was building a throne out of everything they thought I would never reach. It was a Tuesday when I walked into my father's boardroom. Cloudy skies, mild wind, nothing dramatic, which in a way made it more poetic. There were no thunderstorms, no chaos, just a quiet shift in power that no one expected. That's the thing about people like my father and Felicity. They're always watching the weather, never noticing the ground shifting beneath their feet. The lobby receptionist recognized me. She stood quickly. "Miss Clara," she said, blinking. We weren't expecting you." "Good," I replied. "Where's the board meeting being held?" She stammered. "Fifth floor, conference room B. But it's closed." "I know." I walked to the elevator heels echoing across the polished tile, the same tiles that Edward had imported from Italy. I knew because he once gave a speech about how the flooring of a building tells you what kind of mind built it. I rode up in silence. Outside conference room B, the glass walls revealed the scene. Edward at the head of the table, Felicity beside him flipping through a thick binder. James was further down staring at his phone. Around them sat a mix of legal advisors, silent partners, and family friends pretending to be stakeholders. I opened the door. The room froze. Edward stood halfway. "Clara, what is this?" I walked in calmly, a slim black folder in my hand. I thought I'd sit in, seeing as I now own controlling interest in 3 of your holding companies. A beat, then chaos. "What are you talking about?" Felicity snapped. James looked up confused. "Wait, what?" Edward tried to regain control. "This isn't the time. This is a private meeting." "No," I said, placing the folder on the table. "This is a corporate review meeting, and per your own shareholder agreement, any majority interest holder can attend and call for a structural audit." Edward's face began to redden. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." I opened the folder. Inside, notarized documents, transaction records, voting proxies, all tied to shell companies and partner firms, each traced back to me. Edward leaned forward. "You think this is revenge? Because of the wedding? Because someone said something you didn't like?" "No," I said. "This isn't about what someone said. This is about what you took. My work, my name, my value. You took it and repackaged it into something profitable without my knowledge." James finally spoke. "Clara, I didn't know." "You did," I said calmly. "You signed the trust. You smiled through every insult. You stayed quiet when they erased me." I turned to the board. "Effective immediately. I'm calling for a vote to restructure oversight on all public-private projects involving Midpoint Properties, North Crescent Group, and Blue Line Urban Holdings. As majority stakeholder, I'm also demanding a full audit on every partnership formed in the last 24 months. You can't do this," Edward hissed. "I can?" I said. "And I am." Felicity stood. "You're ruining our family." I looked her in the eye. "You ruined the idea of family when you made me a silent player in a legacy I helped build." James tried again. "We can fix this." I held up my hand. "No, James, you had a choice. You chose comfort. You chose inheritance over integrity. You don't get to choose me now." I stepped around the table to the head seat, Edward's seat. I didn't sit in it. Not yet. I just placed my hand on the back of it. "For years, I begged for a seat at this table," I said. "Now I own it." I closed the folder. No yelling, no threats, just clarity. "I'm not burning this place down," I added. "I'm rebuilding it, brick by brick, audit by audit. And I'll start by naming every project that used my designs to court city funds while cutting me out of every return." Silence. Finally, one of the older board members cleared his throat. "If she's majority, we have no legal basis to contest her right to call the vote." Another voice followed. "She's within rights. It's all valid." I looked at Edward. He didn't move. His face, once smug and polished, now looked hollow. Felicity sat down, jaw clenched, defeated. James just looked lost, like someone waking up too late to stop a dream from becoming a nightmare. Meeting adjourned. I said softly. I'll see you all again soon. As I walked out, no one said a word. Outside, the receptionist stood halfway again. I smiled at her. Would you mind letting the accounting department know to prepare for the first review? I'll be sending a list. She blinked, nodded quickly, and reached for the phone. When I stepped into the elevator, I exhaled for the first time all day. There was no music, no crowd, no applause, just silence and power, not the kind you inherit, the kind you take back. It took James 9 days to show up. I wasn't surprised. The headlines had already started swirling quiet whispers. In development circles, a few bold titles in architecture blogs. Silent stakeholder, reshapes urban legacy, runaway bride, now majority owner. No names at first, just speculation. But the people who mattered knew, and James certainly knew. He showed up at GroundUp's office without an appointment. The front desk buzzed. There's a man here to see you, the assistant said, her voice low. He says it's personal. Let him in, I replied. He walked in slowly, like he expected the walls themselves to judge him. His tie was crooked, his eyes tired. He looked like a man who had been hiding in silence and was suddenly forced to speak. Clara, he said almost in a whisper. I didn't stand. He sat across from me, hands clasped, fingers twitching. I didn't know it would go this far, he began. I swear I didn't know about the scope of the trust or the development licensing. Your father, Felicity, they kept me out of the real decision-making. I said nothing. He leaned in. I made a mistake. I should have asked. I should have spoken up. At the wedding, after. Any of it. I just froze. You didn't freeze, I said quietly. You chose. He looked up. You chose to stay in their comfort, I continued. You chose silence. You chose the inheritance, the power, the seat at the table they gave you. He swallowed hard. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. There was no venom in my voice. Just fact. He tried again. Maybe it's not too late. We could, I don't know, start over. I looked him over carefully, like someone reading blueprints after a building had already collapsed. He was still handsome, still polished, but something about him seemed smaller now, dimmed. You don't love me, I said. You love the idea of me. The girl who pulled herself up, who made you feel like you were dating strength and humility all wrapped up in one. But when it was time to protect me, you stood beside the ones who mocked everything I came from. He opened his mouth, but I kept going. You didn't say anything when they ridiculed my mother. You laughed. I didn't think. No, I said, you didn't. And that's the problem. He sat back, his shoulders dropping. So that's it. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then finally he said, I thought you were different. I am, I said. I just finally remembered how different. He stood slowly. I loved you. No, I said again. You liked standing next to me. That's not the same. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. Are you happy now? I looked around the room. Plans for community centers, public housing improvements, grant reports for projects Mom helped inspire. I'm becoming whole, I said. That's better than happy. He nodded like he wanted to understand but couldn't. Then he left. I watched him disappear down the hallway. And just like that, the last thread tying me to that old life came undone. There was no heartbreak, no cinematic pain, just clarity. Love, if it was real, would have stood beside me in that moment at the wedding, would have defended my mother without hesitation, would have said anything when it mattered most. But silence is a choice, and so is walking away. I had made mine. 2 weeks after James walked out of my office, the headlines were no longer whispers. The city released an official statement confirming an internal audit into several urban development contracts awarded to Edwards firms. The news spread fast. Words like conflict of interest, misappropriation of public trust, and fraudulent partnership structures appeared in bold print. I didn't need to make a single press appearance. I didn't have to burn bridges. All I had to do was shine a light. Within a month, 3 of my father's most profitable partnerships had been frozen. One major investor pulled out of a planned billion-dollar expansion project. Felicity deactivated all her social media accounts after the legal community blogs picked up the story. And Edward, well, he issued a public statement about stepping back to focus on family. For the first time in my life, I believed him. Not because he meant it, but because he had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, Ground Up was flourishing. Not because of the press attention, but because our values were finally being seen without a filter. We weren't just designing buildings. We were reshaping how people felt about the places they lived. Our newest project, a repurposed bus terminal turned wellness and resource center, was already serving over 300 families. But something still tugged at me. Recognition was never the goal. I didn't want to be the headline. I wanted to build something lasting, something that made girls like me from places like mine feel like they belonged in the blueprint of the future. So I started the D Foundation. D for Diane, my mother. The woman who never asked for credit, never demanded applause, just showed up, day after day, night after night, raising me with steady hands, clear eyes, and the unshakable belief that hard work wasn't weakness, it was strength. The foundation was simple in concept, but radical in practice. Full scholarships and mentorship programs for young women in under-resourced neighborhoods who wanted to study urban planning, engineering design, or architecture. We didn't just cover tuition, we provided laptops, transportation stipends, and emotional support networks. At our launch ceremony, the mayor presented me with a plaque for outstanding contribution to urban renewal and public trust. I smiled, shook his hand, and took the mic. I didn't give a long speech. I just told a story. I didn't grow up with a legacy fund, I began. There were no trust accounts, no silver spoons. My mom raised me on late-night shifts and instant coffee. I did homework on the salon floor while she patched up scrubs in the kitchen. And the first time I believed I could change the world wasn't in a lecture hall. It was in a chipped-up booth at a 24-hour diner where my mom slid me a cup of tea and said, "Don't lower your head, that's all." The room was quiet. Sometimes I continued, "You don't need to tear things down. You just need to clear out the rot, strip the facade, and rebuild with better materials. Stronger values, brighter minds. That's what we're doing here." Applause followed, but I didn't hear it. I just looked at my mom sitting in the front row wearing the same navy dress she wore the night I walked out of my wedding. She was crying. Later that evening, we returned to the diner, the same one we always had. Same waitress, same sticky menu covers, same chipped booth. Mom sat in her usual spot. I slid a tea across to her and sipped my black coffee. "You really did it," she said, voice quiet. "I didn't do it alone," I replied. She looked down at her tea, then back up at me. "You could have let it go," she said. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," I said, but I wasn't looking for revenge. I was making it clear, clear about what that we don't have to hide anymore. She nodded, wiping her cheek. We sat there in silence for a while. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars passed, neon lights flickered. Somewhere, someone was building something. But inside that booth between the chipped table, the lukewarm coffee, and the woman who shaped every part of me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that wedding. The music, the flowers, the flash of cameras. The way people stared when I took my mother's hand and walked out. Some probably whispered that I ruined a perfectly good marriage. Others might have called it impulsive, ungrateful, dramatic. But I know the truth. I didn't ruin anything. I just refused to stay quiet. And in doing so, I found my voice, the one I'd buried for years, beneath politeness and compromise, and the endless need to be accepted. I think about how easily I could have stayed, smiled through the rest of that night, signed the papers, built someone else's dream while silencing my own. I could have let the inheritance pull me in like a tide, but then I remember my mother. Sitting in that room, humiliated yet still composed, her fork still, her eyes calm, the strength in her silence louder than anything anyone said. That moment changed everything. It wasn't rage that made me leave. It was clarity. I realized I couldn't build a future in a place where my past was treated like a flaw. I couldn't love a man who loved my potential but not my roots. I couldn't sit at a table where the cost of the seat was my dignity. So I walked out, not just from a wedding, but from a cycle. And I built something of my own, not to prove them wrong, but to prove that I never needed them to be right. To anyone who's been mocked, erased, underestimated, this story is for you. You don't have to shout, you don't have to fight dirty, you don't even have to get even. You just have to know your worth, protect your peace, and build anyway. Because there is power in leaving. There is strength in starting over. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be who they expect and become exactly who you are. I'm not asking you to applaud me. I'm just asking you to ask yourself, what would you have done? Because I didn't set out to make a scene. I just refused to stay in one.